I think he's not a new name as well. If we talk about this Indonesian punks as well as Bandung. So, Jim, where are you? Are you here yet?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Okay, Jim, so what will you present to us today? What it's all about, the highlight probably?
The highlight, right? Well, we'll see. I'm in a similar situation to Elise because last week I was on strike at work. So I was standing outside in the cold Irish winter weather waving a placard instead of doing any preparation work for this. So normally I would like to use images and slides and some music and I sort of rely on all that stuff, but it makes the process of speaking into the void a bit less daunting. But I haven't got any of that today, so I'm just going to speak on the themes of the conference, and I'm going to look at decolonizing global punk in terms of the circuits, networks, and connections that we're talking about.
Okay, wow, sounds cool. Okay, so then, Jim, the time and place is yours, please.
All right, so hello, everyone. Thanks to Fakran, Rahar, all the presenters today, and everyone at PSN Indonesia. It's another excellent set of presentations and discussions, and it's a real punk spirit to it. Once again, you guys are, I think, an inspiration to us all. So as I said, yeah, today I'm going to talk about punk internationalism and punk globalization within this wider theme of circuits, networks, and connections. And I specifically want to think about decolonizing global punk. And maybe this responds in some ways to Elise's question about how we break down power dynamics in our research. So I'll speak about neoliberalism and punk's complicated relationship with neoliberalism, how anarchism weaves its way through that or against that. I'll discuss punk scenes that are on the margins or in the hinterlands of global cultural flows. And I'll focus that discussion down a bit on a comparison of punk scenes in Indonesia and China before introducing my current research project and talking about how I'm trying to tackle these issues of colonial violence practically in my punk research with some innovative methodologies. So as I say, I have to get my excuses in. I'm a trade union activist, so we were on strike last week, and now we're on action short of strike, which means I couldn't even do any extra catch-up work. So instead of sitting at my desk preparing all the bells and whistles for an all singing, all dancing keynote presentation, I was outside in the cold. I'm inside in the warm now. It's actually too warm, but I can't complain. For those of you who aren't aware of the local context, universities here in Northern Ireland and across the UK have been striking periodically for the last 3 years or so over issues related to pensions and also against the widespread use of what they call casualized contracts at universities here. No doubt many of you will be familiar with this type of pseudo-employment. It's short-term, it's part-time, there's no job security, and it's ultimately very exploitative and damaging. To link that back to the task at hand, we might think about some of the connections between punk and trade union activism and working class consciousness. Oi and street punk spring to mind immediately. Lots of songs about striking workers and so on. Dropkick Murphys from the US are probably the most famous example of that sort of thing, but you might think about local examples like Working Class Records in Jakarta. I know Fakran's a big Oi fan, so he can tell you much more about that scene. Or here in Northern Ireland, you might think a band like Running Riot, another Oi band, a lot of focus on trade unionism and working class consciousness. Or you could cut it the other way and look at the influence of punk on trade unions via anarchist and anarcho-syndicalist politics. The Industrial Workers of the World has developed a punk cultural aspect across many of its branches. Some people have described it as a scrappy DIY workers union. I sort of get the feeling that it is a punk union, even though it's it's over 100 years old, but it was punk before it was punk. Again, I think there's a lot of that in Indonesia at the minute as well. I've been impressed with the prominence of punk aesthetics in the high-profile May Day anarchist Black Bloc demonstrations that have made so many headlines across cities in Indonesia in recent years. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that as a punk and an anarchist, I had to absolutely be on the picket line supporting the strike last week. So you'll have to excuse me for the lack of slides. But I mean, the core reason for those strikes that we were on is the ongoing marketization of universities, and that is the application of neoliberal economics to teaching, to research, and to all the work we do. And I can segue into the actual presentation here. When it comes to thinking about circuits, networks, and connections of punk, neoliberalism is an inescapable factor here as well. So to focus on neoliberalism and punk for a minute, in a forthcoming chapter for the Anarchism and Punk book project, which I'm helping to edit, a scholar called Max Woods is writing about the emergence of punk in Chile in South America. And he writes, as his opening line to the chapter, he says, "Punk is a globalized culture of neoliberalism." That's a big statement, and it's a contentious one. And Max's intention to be contentious with that statement. Neoliberalism has had a really damaging aspect on all sorts of aspects of our lives. I was on strike against neoliberalization of work last week. In Chile, it was the murderous General Pinochet who ushered in neoliberalism. In the UK, it was Pinochet's close friend, Margaret Thatcher, who did the same. And these guys, these are the bad guys in most punk narratives, right? So what does it mean to say that punk is a globalized culture of neoliberalism? Is Max right to say that? And what does it mean for punk's circuits and networks and connections today? There's actually an interesting historical comparison to make here with the anarchist movement of the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. Benedict Anderson, who had a keen interest in Indonesia, of course, argued that coordinations between international anarchist movements were made possible because of what he calls early globalization. So this is important. Anarchism's international networks relied on the spread of capitalist globalization in the late 1800s, both in terms of infrastructure, the physical transport and emerging communication systems like the telegraph, and in flows of culture. And here, of course, the centres and peripheries that were established by colonialism and imperialism laid the template for capitalist cultural networks. And these have been largely replicated in neoliberal globalization as well. But that fact doesn't diminish the anarchist critiques of capitalism and colonialism. These internationalist networks worked through the circuits of global capital, but they emphatically worked against global capital at the same time. So yes, we can recognize that the cultural opening up that accompanies the economics of neoliberal globalization has repeatedly been the opportunity for punk culture to spread around the world. But that recognition doesn't mean that punk is necessarily complicit in neoliberalism, and it does not blunt punk's critical counterpoint to mainstream capitalist culture. Max Woods, in his chapter, he recognizes all that complexity, but in the end, as he puts it, quite bluntly, global punk would not exist without neoliberalism. And if we think about it, the relationship is hard to deny. Ben Holtzman argues in a recent book that New York was really a crucible of neoliberal urban policies and economics in New York's long crisis of the late 1960s through the 1970s into the 1980s. And of course, it was this time and this place that was an early birthing pond for punk as well. The UK government signed up for its first crisis loan of $3.9 billion from the IMF in 1976, just as the first British punk bands were emerging. So neoliberalism and punk were in some ways entangled by circumstance from their very beginnings. Maybe it was more than circumstance. Maybe it was a shared condition of crisis that punk was responding to, that neoliberalism was benefiting from. In any case, the economic restructuring that accompanied the UK's IMF loan and the Thatcher regime of the 1980s, that shaped punk's political development in all sorts of important ways. And we can see the same relationships and patterns elsewhere too. If we return to Chile, that Max Woods was writing about, the imposition of neoliberal economics meant opening up to outside investors. It also came with a suppression, violent, bloody suppression of indigenous associated socialist cultural movements, and opened up the space for the arrival of global media, not least in terms of music. You can even look at Eastern Bloc countries that were countries of Eastern Europe that were under the Soviet sphere of influence. Arguably, clearly at some distance from neoliberalism when punk scenes emerged there in the early 1980s. But the biggest waves of popularity for punk in those places actually occurred in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the socialistic regimes, and when neoliberal capitalist globalization and all its cultural accoutrements flooded in. So around the world, we can see a relationship between punk and between the cultural flows of neoliberal globalization. But it's not a straightforward relationship, and it's not necessarily a causal relationship. And as I've stressed, it's not necessarily a factor of complicity. Punk isn't complicit in neoliberalism just because it sort of rides on its coattails. So I'll discuss the two comparative examples I want to look at now, Indonesia and China. I'll be drawing this material from a forthcoming article about decolonizing global punk that will appear in Cultural Critique, I think in summer 2022, that I've co-authored with Zhan Zhao, who's now based in Hangzhou. And thanks to Zhan if she's watching this. Indonesia and China are interesting places to compare. They both have exciting, vibrant punk scenes. They are both at some distance from the traditional centres of globalised capitalist culture, and indeed some distance from the Anglo-American birthing ponds of punk. But they are otherwise quite distinct contexts, both in terms of their colonial and post-colonial histories and their contemporary positionings within the wider global economy. It's also the case that direct cultural connections between these places are fairly limited, especially when it comes to punk culture. So in a way, it's only really possible to make sense of these places in comparison when you do that within a global punk framing. And the key part I think we're interested in today is how that global punk framing relates to neoliberal globalization, and whether this horizontal comparison, can offer a critical vantage on punk's internationalism. The aspect of punk scenes in Indonesia and China that I think helps to illuminate all this is DIY gigs, or do-it-yourself shows is the American term. So gigs or shows are the foundation of punk communities. It's where scenes express themselves. It's how they manifest themselves as a community. DIY is crucial as well. Elise was talking about it in terms of how it relates to grassroots politics. It's an anarchistic production politics. It's an everyday expression of cultural resistance. And I think anybody who is involved in punk or has been studying punk will have some sense of the importance of DIY gigs to punk. So when we compare the DIY gigs of punks in Indonesia and China, we can draw some conclusions that should have a bearing on punk scenes everywhere. So to start with the emergence of punk in Indonesia and China, there's quite some comparative similarities here in In Indonesia, it was in the context of the weakening of the New Order regime in the 1990s that punk began to grow in popularity. MTV broadcasts began in 1995. People were able to pick up leaked radio signals from Australia. And as my friend Sean Martin Iverson puts it, the popularity of underground music in the 1990s occurred in this context of increased access to global media and the decline of the authoritarian New Order regime's cultural and political hegemony. During the Reformasi period, after the downfall of Suharto, punk's popularity surged even further in the early 2000s. It's actually a pretty similar story for China in some ways. The economic reforms there in 1978 were accompanied with a limited cultural opening up as well. So Western media was now available to people there, and there was an exposure to Western values along with that. China didn't experience the same successful revolutionary resistance movement and regime change as happened in Indonesia in the late 1990s, but the Tiananmen Square movement of 1989 and the state's bloody repression of that did cause a shift in state policy, which has been described as a move towards soft authoritarianism by Selden and Perry. This was during the 1990s, and this opened up space for cultural expression, and that included the emergence of punk scenes in China. So in both cases, global media, this cultural product of globalized neoliberal capitalism, if we want to put it that way, infiltrated these places, and in doing so, it displaced the prior cultural hegemony or the cultural dominance of the local ruling elites. So it was these cracks that in the system that punk took root within in both China and in Indonesia. And as I've suggested, it's the same story for loads of other places around the world. Okay, but let's bring the discussion down to the nuts and bolts of DIY gig production. Again, there are some interesting similarities between Indonesia and China. And arguably, the emphasis of DIY in these places is different to conceptions of DIY that are informed solely by Western experiences, and that's key. So to explain, these are very different contexts. In Indonesia, the collapse of the Suharto regime ushered in an acceleration of neoliberal globalization. Multinational corporations moved in even greater numbers to exploit the people and the natural resources of Indonesia, and this is still going on today. Elise talked about some of the activism against that in Indonesia. But in China, the shift was towards a state capitalist model under the Chinese Communist Party. And the arrival of multinational corporations there was and continues to be carefully coordinated and limited by the authoritarian state. So DIY gigs, punk gigs in Indonesia and China might well share something in terms, broad terms of an expression of anarchistic production politics or cultural resistance, but the distinctiveness of those local contexts is crucial. One is state capitalist masquerading as communist. The other one is acutely neoliberalized capitalism. So two different economic contexts. DIY is going to look different in those contexts. When DIY is understood, especially through anarchist analyses in the West, it's understood as being anti-capitalist. For example, Sandra Jepson, punk scholar, anarchist scholar in Canada, writes that a defining feature of DIY is that it keeps the production, distribution, and consumption process as separate from capitalism as possible. So that's keeping prices low, using pay no more than notices, avoiding alienated labor and exploitation, establishing alternative distribution networks, and so on and so on. So while that clearly resonates with the acutely neoliberalized capitalist context of Indonesia, the economic pressures on cultural production are felt somewhat differently in communist China. But in fact, despite those differences, when we compare DIY punk gigs in Indonesia and China, the striking similarity is their striving towards artistic and organizational autonomy, especially in their resistance to or evasion from state interference and corruption. And that's far more prominent than the Western emphasis on the separation from capitalist modes of production. Now, it is the case that punks in China make efforts to reduce the commercial influence on punk gigs and performances, which could be interpreted as chiming with Jepson's anti-capitalist point. But the core conflict between the Chinese government and punks is centered on the political aspect of punk performance. The state actively polices the boundaries of what is acceptable for punks to do and say while on stage. State-sanctioned opportunities to perform for punks are really scarce, so punks in China seek out every opportunity they can to organize DIY gigs away from the state's control. And actually, it's similar in Indonesia. People have been vocally critical of gigs or shows that are sponsored by cigarette companies or other corporations because of the risk of recuperation or co-optation of alternative culture. And that's important, no doubt. But the organization of punk gigs in Indonesia is also hampered by state authorities. So even if punks organizing a gig manage to get the permit from the local police to hold the event, having negotiated all kinds of censorship and bureaucratic bullshit along the way, the gigs will still very likely be plagued by police looking for bribes. I think any punk in Indonesia will be familiar with that scenario. I remember playing at Libertad Fest in 2015. It's a punk festival organized by Bandung Pirate Punks. And the festival was right out in an island in the middle of the Java Sea. And we traveled for hours on a ferry to get there. But even there, out in the middle of the Java Sea, the police arrived by boat to extort bribes from the organizers. There was no evasion from the corrupt cops. The other option for people in cities is to hold gigs in military bases, but that option doesn't offer much in the way of autonomy either. So Indonesian punks then feel a similar pressure as the punks in China in terms of organizing gigs and this emphasis on organizational and artistic autonomy. And that's despite the ostensibly distinct wider contexts. And the outworkings of that emphasis on artistic expression and organizational autonomy is various forms of resistance and evasion, as I've intimated. The key argument here is that that's a conclusion that we would not reach or could not reach through a cultural imperialist framing, right? Analyses of DIY production that are limited to the West, as I've said, focus on that anti-capitalist aspect as a defining feature. And while that does resonate with Indonesia and China in terms of anti-commercialism, this other underlying ethos of artistic and organizational autonomy is revealed through the comparative analysis of these other contexts, and doing that without imposing Western punk norms. So the task is to analyze the everyday consciousness. This is a deliberately decolonizing shift away from the Anglo-American lens towards horizontal comparison. As Schwa puts it, this helps us towards generating different forms of knowledge. So a decolonized global punk framing also resonates with ideas of critical regionalism, to which Frampton ascribes the capacity to cultivate a resistant, identity-giving culture, while at the same time having discrete recourse to universal technique. So to break that down a wee bit, the universal technique in our case is the DIY ethos or DIY production politics, and the associated shared language of anarchist resistance. And punks embrace this in their global or internationalist consciousness, right? But this is emphatically not a form of universalism. Okay, the local is in creative tension with the global at all times. So even though punk has its roots in the Anglo-American contexts, a contemporary and critical decolonized global punk can decenter and disrupt that Anglo-American analytical lens. So that brings us to the final bit of my presentation today, where I want to think about how we can apply this decolonized global punk epistemology in our work as punk researchers. My current research project that I'm working on here at Ulster University in the north of Ireland is titled Field States and Creative Resistances, the Everyday Life of Punks in Belfast, Banda Aceh, Mitrovica and Soweto. So in case you don't know, those are places in Northern Ireland, Indonesia, Kosovo and South Africa. I started this project about 6 months ago. I've actually just returned from fieldwork in Kosovo, and I'll be working on this for the next few years. Those contexts are all what is commonly referred to as post-conflict, but they're chiefly chosen because of their marginal position within global flows and transmissions of culture. And the project's focus on those global punk hinterlands is critically decentering. And this decentering, it's not just foisting an academic concept onto a research topic, because it actually reflects the lived experience of punk cultural transmission across the globe today. So what I mean by that in practical terms is that if you're a punk in Banda Aceh, 1980s Japanese raw punk is as likely to be an influence for you as are the Sex Pistols. Or if you're Soweto punk, it might be early 2000s Florida folk punk instead of The Clash. Or if you're Belfast punk, 1990s Scandinavian DB might be a musical touchstone more than the Ramones. Or if you're in Mitrovica, you might be more interested in contemporary Mexican anarcho-punk than you are in the Buzzcocks. So I want this research to break out of the constraints of punk scholarship's Anglo-American moorings and to make a deliberate interventionist challenge to normal neo-colonial, neoliberal flows of culture, which also infect punk. And that's what decolonized global punks are already attempting to do.
Right.
So the intervention in the research is the development of dialogue between these punk contexts. So the research project will get these scenes talking and making cultural exchanges with one another directly, not via neoliberal cultural global centers. Methodologically, then, that takes the form of group curation of a 12-inch vinyl album reflecting on their specific scenes. So this creative method provides opportunities for these groups to express a collective identity of their scene tied to their punk musical aesthetic and their cultural production. So groups of research participants in each place will discuss and debate this compilation of local punk songs of their context. They decide what to include, they decide what to leave out, as well as the cover art and everything else. So it's a creative, curative process, and they will address the things that they deem important. My job as a researcher in that process is just to facilitate it and document it. That's the innovative methodology that I'm trying to deploy in these 4 places. So, as I mentioned, the records are an opportunity for inter-context dialogue. Each compilation group will be able to reflect on the compilations that are produced by their comrades in the other research contexts. I will move these records around and beyond to distribute them through DIY punk distribution networks. And again, this is actually just tapping into the existing flows of culture that punk already has, using this existing shared language of the compilation record. I don't know about the rest of you, but this is how I find out about other punk scenes. Usually, it's a compilation record that I found somewhere that introduces me to a whole scene or a whole genre of music. And the research project intervenes to help punks in these marginal hinterland contexts to bypass the neo-colonial, neoliberal channels of cultural exchange to develop direct communication and cultural flow between those places. So that's what decentering means, and that's what a creative decolonized research method can look like within this global punk consciousness. To finish up, I think this conference and the Punk Scholars Network more widely is all about making new networks and new connections. And that's at the heart of a decolonized global punk consciousness. It's been my great pleasure to be part of this conference, and maybe as a challenge to neoliberal capitalist culture, maybe we can use this opportunity. I hope we can use this opportunity to develop exchanges of knowledge and create those new cultural flows that are decentering around the margins. So thanks again to Fakran, Rahar, and everybody involved in organizing this. I will copy a list of my references into the chat box now, so you can check those out. My email address is in there already. Drop me a line. I look forward to your questions and comments. Terima kasih banyak.
Okay, terima kasih, Jim, for the presentation. And the idea of decolonizing these global punks is actually quite similar to what happened to black metal a couple of years ago. We have like a documentary movie called The Allées de l'Enfer. It's from the French, I don't know. The name is Matthew Carnegie, and he played in a band called Aluk Todolo, different from the ritual in Indonesia as well. And they try to capture the surface of how Indonesian try to reinterpret the essence of black metal. Some says that this is a misinterpretation of black metal, but this is, for me, I can see that probably this one is an authentic efforts from the people to interpret something that derived from the global phenomenon. Probably, well, if we compare to the original one, the global one, the first phenomenon, probably it's not really in line, but at certain points, I think we have this authentic and probably honest interpretation towards a certain phenomenon. Probably punk also experiencing the same things with these black metal stars. I don't know, but probably we can talk about it later. Okay, thank you so much, Jim, for the presentation. And now we have to move to the final